Hello, Marco here. I hope you're fine. This time we are covering a topic for which I got a lot of requests, which is how to make a physics motorbike simulation using chaos vehicles. And this is largely undocumented, so you have to go through the source code and play a bit with some of the settings in the vehicle movement component. But here it is, that's what we'll be creating in this tutorial. By the way, if you want to get the ready-made project, the link is in the description, so you save yourself the time to do it, and you also get some extra features for a small fee. Without further ado, let's get started. Okay, the first thing that we need is to find ourselves a very nice motorbike model. If you are a modeler, of course, you can create one yourself, not as much of a modeler. So I looked up something available for free on CG Trader, and I found this one by the Pingerman, whom I would like to thank very much for sharing this with the community for free. And you can download it by pressing on the free download button. And then as soon as the link is available, you can download directly the Blender file. Once we get this in Blender, we'll have to open it and do a bit of cleanup because this model is staged for screenshot static rendering, and actually we need to animate it later on, so it needs a bit of rearrangement of the parts as well. So let's download it. By the way, I already have it, so I will not do it. And once it's done, you want to unzip it onto a folder and then open the Blender file. Okay, once we have the model in Blender, there are a few steps that we have to make in order to get it ready for Unreal. I'm not going to show them in full because that's very time consuming, but I will show you the main ones and we will do the final ones together. So first, you want to separate the different parts that we need to animate later. So the bike has to have a body, and the body has all the non-moving parts. And then we have a rear wheel. The rear wheel has basically the tire, the rim, the pinion for the chain, in this case, the gear, and the brake disc. The brake caliper that is here, of course, it's solid with the body. Front wheel is a bit more complicated because we have a fork, and that one will have to be animated for steering. So the front wheel also has the tire, the rim, and the brake disc. The brake caliper, of course, is solid to the fork because it moves with it. Second important thing is the pivot points for all these parts. Okay, so for the rear wheel, as you see, the pivot point is placed in the center of the geometry, both on the y-axis and on the x-axis as well, for the rear. There it is. So one test you have to make, go to the lateral view, take the wheel in the center, select it, press R, and then rotate around it. So you should see it rotating properly, even though here I think the texture was a bit of a defect, but the wheel rotates properly. You have to do the same thing for the front one, which, as a reminder, is parental to the fork. So select it, R, yes, that also rotates properly. Now make sure that the whole bike is aligned toward the positive x-axis, so it should be driving in the direction of the positive x-axis. That's very important. As last thing, as you see, the fork has an inclination. We need to fix that because we need to animate it along its local axis, and right now the local axis is pointing up, so we don't want that. So the way to fix it is to eyeball its rotation. So we rotate it until it's basically perpendicular, and I think that you can eyeball it a bit, a rotation of around 32.2 degrees in this model. So let's clear the X and the Z because we don't need it. Now remember this number, 32.2 degrees. Now we go Object, Apply, Rotation. Okay, now you see that the local axis is aligned with the fork. And now we apply the same angle but negative. And this time we do not apply the rotations. For the rest, all the rotations and the transformations of the model have been applied. Now, if you see the dimensions of the model, so let's, for example, select the body. We want to go to the scale, to the scene, unit, and metric. And then this one, we're going to put it to 0.01 because Unreal uses centimeters as base unit. Now you see that the model is super tiny. So we'll take A, scale, and let's put 100. I think we need more because it was tiny to start with. So at the moment, along the x-axis is like 0.5 meter. We don't want that. So let's probably this kind of bike should be what, 2.5 meters, 3 meters. So let's scale it a bit more. A to select everything, scale, and let's come up to, let's say 2.5 meters. Sounds about right. If you have doubts, you can check on the internet what normal bike size is, but that this looks reasonable. Now back onto the view here. Okay, we might want to do a G and realign it up on the x-axis. Not really necessary. I think it can also stay here in the middle. Now let's check that our fork is still oriented properly. Okay, one last thing to do. We will not use directly the wheels as physics bones. We want to add our own. So let's go into basically select the front fork, and inside, okay, let's select the front wheel. And then we will add the tiny mesh. It can also be a scale 0 mesh in place of it. So let's add, for example, a cube. Of course, it didn't take that position because the 3D cursor was not there. So let's redo it. Once it's selected, Shift S, and we say cursor to selected. So now we have the center, add mesh cube. So now we have this cube, which is gigantic. We can scale it down to almost nothing. Actually, it's easier if you do it with the keyboard. 001 S 001 became very tiny, but it's in place, and we'll make sure later on it's parented to the body, but let's call it front physics wheel. And then we do the same for the rear one. So select, Shift S, cursor to selected, good, add mesh cube, it's huge, so S to scale, 0.001. Now we have a super tiny cube, which is in there. And this cube, we call it rear physics wheel. So that's good. Now both of these needs to be parented to the body, so shift drag on top of the body and shift drag on top of the body. And I guess they are not parented, are they? Maybe they were already parented and I unparented them. That's likely. Anyway, they are now parented both to the body. So to summarize, we have the body with everything connected to it, and you see that it has different materials will be used later on. Then we have the front fork with its own orientation, local orientation along this axis around which it will have to rotate. By the way, let's check the front. Is it centered? Yes, looks also centered. That is good. And then we have the front wheel, the visual one, parented to it. Next, we have the rear wheel, also parented to the body. And then we have, for the front wheel, with the same pivot, and with the rear wheel, with the same pivot, the invisible, almost invisible cubes, which we'll be using as bones for the front physics wheel and the rear physics wheel. So this is good. We have one last step, which is to apply all scales. We don't want to apply the rotation, otherwise we lose now the rotation of the front fork, but you might want to apply it as well. So object, actually select all with A, object, apply, scale. Okay, so now all the scales are applied, and we basically should have decent size bike. So you see the body seems to be 2.5. Let's see the body with the fork. So probably that's a decent size, and we can use that as our model. So last but not least, select all, file. By the way, let's save this as the UE version of, in case we want to make changes later. And now with everything selected, we go File, Export, FBX. Now we're going to export it with this name. By the way, I have a number of presets for Unreal, but so we want to export the selected objects. We want to export only the mesh. We don't need anything else. Scale as it stays as it is. For Unreal, the forward axis is the x-axis and the up axis is the z-axis. Okay. Apply unit, use space transforms, then we can leave it as is. Geometry, important not to get a warning to use face, so smoothing face. Apply modifiers, we have already applied them all, that's very important. You will do it before this part that I shown, and then there will be no armature, so, and we don't need to bake in animation. And we can export. So this is how you prepare your model to be imported into Unreal. Very important, we didn't rig it. So we didn't add any armature, we didn't add any bone. And the reason is that we'll be using a feature which is built into Unreal to have it automatically rig the model for you. And that's the reason why we arranged it in this hierarchy. The hierarchy will be used by Unreal to automatically generate the bones. Now let's move on to importing this into Unreal. Okay, at this point we are ready to work in Unreal Engine. So let's start the Epic Launcher. And from there, we will go to Unreal Engine 5.2.1, which is the very latest version, and launch it. Once it is loaded, we go to Games, and then we start a new project based on the vehicle template. I will call it Motorbike Toot. Blueprint is fine, desktop maximum quality, we don't need any starter content or ray tracing, so create. We don't need to look into any plugins, and the first thing we're going to do once the project opens is have a look at the structure. So we have a few folders in this project. Let's look a bit closer. We have the sports car, and then within the blueprints we also have the blueprints for the sport car. So this is basically the skeleton mesh with also the animation blueprint, control rig, we'll talk about this a bit later, physics asset, of course the skeleton, and then its materials. And then under the vehicle template blueprint, we have the blueprint, the main pawn. So this is the car. We have an engine curve, engine torque curve, which we can reuse. And then we have two blueprints, one for the front wheels and one for the rear wheels. What we want to do is make full copy of this, and in here we'll be importing our bike later. So let's start by making a full copy of the sports car. So under blueprint, we make a new folder and we call it chopper. And then we go back to sports car. We select all of them and then we drag them on the chopper folder. And at that point, we are giving the possibility to do a copy. So we'll copy them there. You see 4 items copied. So if we go into the chopper, now we have the items. We just need to rename them. So let's follow the same logic. The first one will rename it as chopper pawn. First one, this the torque curve will be chopper, torque curve, and the same for the wheels. So basically, whatever it's named sports car, we'll replace it with chopper. And we spell it correctly. Okay, now we have the foundation to build our chopper, but it's not yet the bike, right? However, we want already to make sure that our game mode later on will spawn the bike and not the sports car. So of course we can create an own game mode, but let's reuse the current one. So if we go under blueprints, we'll find various game modes. So this level is using the vehicle add game mode. So that's the one we want to change. And as you see, this one is spawning as default pawn the sports car. So we want to change this to our chopper pawn. The rest can stay the same. So compile and save. Perfect. And now if we play, everything works as it should. But actually, if we press F8 to eject for a moment, and we check into the level, we should see that the spawn pawn is actually our chopper pawn. Okay, so that's exactly what we wanted. It means that the game mode is using properly the pawn that we have now set. Of course, the pawn is still the sports car, but we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, now we are ready to import our bike into Unreal. If we open Explorer and we look into the folder where we open the original blend file, we'll find our exported FBX and also the copy that we saved. One folder above, there is a texture folder. So we're gonna cut this one and then paste it within Forma so that we can tell Unreal where to find the material. There's only one texture in there, but that's exactly what we need. So that's done. Now within Unreal, in the content drawer, let's go under vehicles and create ourselves a chopper folder. We can import the bike too. And once we're in it, we click import, and then we find ourselves in the folder where our FBX is, and we select it, open. Now this is very, very important. To have Unreal do automatically the rigging, we need to force this to be imported as a skeletal mesh and set the printing of the components we have created in the FBX file in Blender will be used for the rigging. So let's force this to be skeletal mesh, and then we can also say to search materials locally, if any, and click import all. Let's wait a moment for Unreal to do its work. There might be some messages like this, that's fine, that's perfect. Even though, okay, a couple of parts didn't have a UV set, so Unreal automatically created for us, that's fine. And here you can see all the materials that have been created in Blender. Of course, these are not Unreal Engine materials, so we might have to tweak a few of them. But here is our bike, and we have the skeletal mesh. We have the physics asset, which has been automatically created, but we will have to fix it. And then we have the skeleton. As you can see, we have no animation blueprint yet. We'll do that at a later step. First, let's open the skeletal mesh and check a few things. So first of all, you want to make sure that the orientation of the vehicle is correct. So you see the bike is riding along the positive x-axis. That's perfect. So this will work. The other thing you need to check is the approximate size. So we have, well, apparently a very, very long bike. It's 4 meters and 28. So probably we could have sized it a bit smaller in Blender, but that's fine. You can always go back and resize it a bit. This bike is huge. It's like a car. Anyway, it will work for the tutorial. The other thing that you want to do is move to the skeleton, click on the body, and make sure that the scale of the root bone, the body, is 1:1:1. Anything else will not work. Common mistake when exporting from Blender is to have the wrong scale. So if you see a scale of 100, 100, 100, that will not work. So you have to go back to Blender, fix your scene units, and make sure that it's exported with the proper dimensions. Since we are here, let's also have a look at the bones. So you see that we have the front fork bone. And by the way, if you see the orientation of the bone and the way it rotates, that's exactly what we need. And that's the reason why we gave it that local rotation in Blender. And the front wheel, we can also check that it's not rotating as it should, but let's get to the left view and then select it front wheel. You see, we seem to have a problem with it. We have a problem which is given by the adjustments that we made to the fork. Okay, so let's check if the rear wheel is rotating properly. Yes, that one it is, but the front is not. So how do we fix that? Close. We go back in Blender. So let's reopen the modified Blender file. Let's select the front wheel, and if we look at the local axis, you see that indeed it doesn't have the orientation it should have. So the way to fix that is basically to only for the front wheel, object, apply, rotation. And now we have the correct rotation. Okay. So once again, we can select it all. And by the way, we can also get the chance to scale it a bit, which we can do. So let's select all. Yes, I think that we should scale it by probably 0.75. That should get a better dimension. Now remember, object, apply, scale, very, very important. Let's save this as a new Blender file, export, FBX. Again, select object, mesh, X forward, Z up, face, armature we don't need, and the bake we don't need, and we can export it on top of the previous one. So now let's close this. Actually make sure that we have saved the Blender file, and then back into a real content drawer. On the chopper, skeletal mesh, right click, reimport. Okay, let's open it. Okay, now the size is a bit better, 3.62 meters, still quite a big bike, but okay. And let's now check that the front fork still has the riding condition and the front wheel now rotates as expected. Okay, so we have fixed the previous issue and you now see how that can be done. Note also that we have the front physics wheel that also rotates on the right axis, and then we have the rear physics wheel which also rotates properly. And of course these are not visible because these are the tiny cubes that we created, but that's what exactly we need in order to have the physics be applied to these invisible wheels and then replicate the movement through the animation blueprint to the visible wheels. Okay, now that we have checked everything is as it should in the skeletal mesh, we can move on to the physics asset. And as you can see, this looks a bit like a mess. So what we want to do is right click on body and then delete all bodies below. So we'll start from scratch, okay? Now you don't see anything anymore on this little gear icon, show all bones. First thing is for the body, we want to right click and add the shape like a box. Okay, we'll keep it very, very simple. Box has been added, but it's tiny, so let's make it bigger. And what we want to do is have a box which basically is covering pretty much the body. And okay, maybe it's too large as a side view. Like this will be good. Yeah, maybe a bit less, that's fine. Why box? Because it's symmetric, so that doesn't create any problem. And the second one, it's definitely easier to work with, right? So we can tweak it much more easily. So let's use this level. So it should not touch the floor, because otherwise the bike will be sitting on this body, and I've seen this error multiple times. So make sure that there is a clearance below it, okay? Now what we want to do is select the bone for the rear wheel, right click, add shape. Actually, we can also do it from automatically here from the tool, right? So we'll say add body, sphere, and add bodies. So we get a shape which is perfectly sized to the wheel. Now we go to advanced and we scroll down until we see body setup primitives, sphere, and note the radius of the sphere, that's 47. So we Ctrl+C, copy it, and now we go to the rear physics wheel and we do the same. So we'll add the body and then check that this body has the exact same radius, which doesn't have. So we go into the radius and we paste the previous one. And now we can delete the body that was on the visual wheel. Okay, so now the physics body is actually parented to the physics bone that we want to use. So we'll do the same from the front wheel. Use the tool here to add the body. We'll get automatically the radius it needs. Let's check it. 47, so copy that. And then front wheel, add the sphere as well. Go down to its radius and paste it. And of course, we don't need this anymore. So this concludes a bit the work that we have to do on the physics asset. Just make sure that there are constraints, and actually, according to the documentation, we should also force this to be kinematic, so physics type, kinematic. And note that there is a bug, because this should change into a little lock, but it doesn't. Let's see if after we save it, physics type, kinematic. So basically the two bodies, two spheres that are part of the wheels, we set them to kinematic. Also make sure that the constraints are positioned in the right place. That's where the suspensions will go. And I think we are ready to roll with this one. So save. Actually, let's also save here, and let's save also the skeletal mesh with all the materials. And let's close that. Now we're ready to go back to our blueprints chopper folder and open the vehicle blueprint, the chopper bone, and then inside mesh we can actually replace the skeletal mesh of the car with the skeletal mesh of the chopper. And if we go into the viewport, now we have our chopper. Now, a couple of things to check. For example, the front camera, that's nice. I think I will put it like in the position, supposed position of the head of the player. And then the back camera, yeah, it's far in the distance, that will work. By the way, we should already be able to check this as it will be spawned. And yes, it is spawned. but of course it doesn't drive. And it falls as well. And it doesn't drive because we have not set up anything regarding the vehicle movement component and the physics. Now, one thing that we have to do is back to the physics asset, check the mass of the body. Okay, for a motorbike, we want to use a mass of 350 kilos. So I check the mass property here and put in 350. So save, and back in the blueprint, under vehicle movement component, if you search for mass, we will also give the same indication, okay? 350 kilos. Compile all this and remove the filter, otherwise you don't see the other properties, and save. Okay, next we need to work on the configuration of the bike, because of course we want it to be able to drive around. So the first thing that we want to do is bike only has 2 wheels. So here we need to delete wheel 3 and wheel 2. Okay, we only have 2 wheels. First, the front wheel. So this one will be chopper. We have to select the correct blueprint for the wheels. So remember that we have copied that from the sports car, and now it's chopper wheels front. And if you remember, the bone is called front physics wheel. Make sure there are no spelling mistakes, because otherwise it will not work. And for the second wheel, we'll use a chopper wheel rear. And of course not wheels, but it's wheel. Okay, we keep it plural. And here it will be rear physics wheel. Okay, so make sure that you use the right bone names. If you are unsure, you just go back to the physics asset, which is here. You know, make sure, oh, now the icons, by the way, are proper. Or the skeleton, and then you say, okay, front physics wheel. You can also right click and do copy selected bone names and then paste it in the vehicle movement component. But otherwise, I think you can remember them. Good, so back into the vehicle movement component, there are a couple more adjustments that we have to make. So since this is dedicated to a car, so here we can leave everything as is, but the steering setup needs to be changed. Okay, so a motorbike doesn't have any Ackermann steering, so we'll say single angle, and you can use the angle ratio as is, and we can keep it 0.7. This one we will adjust a bit later, but for a bike we need a slightly different steering curve. So what this does is changing the amount of steering proportionally to the speed. The faster you go, and the less it will steer, because otherwise it becomes difficult to control at very high speed. And there is one last thing that we want to do, which is enable center of mass override. So a bike has a quite low center of mass because of stability. So in here we can input something like minus 40. So we'll be 40 centimeters below the center of that elongated cube we have used as body, physics body for the body of the bike. Okay, so let's see how this works. It might be different how this works. It might be different for your bike. You might have to tweak it a bit, but that should give a bit more of extra stability. So compile and save. And now let's see what happens if we play. Okay, starting to look like something. Of course it doesn't drive yet, does it? Yeah, of course it does. And as you can see, it doesn't seem to be very stable. Actually it has a bit of stability already, but we'll make this better. What it doesn't do, of course, it doesn't animate yet, but this is something that we can fix shortly. Okay. One thing to check is, okay, where are my wheels? Is that sitting properly? Is it driving as it should? And we can do that by using some debug features. So one way to do it is, in here we can say, if we type debug draw, we can see that under physics there is P, physics, chaos, debug draw enabled. And we'll add a 1. So we enable that, and then we do P chaos.chaos.solver.debug draw shapes 1. And this one will show the physics body which are used by the physics engine. So if we play again, now we see how our bike is going, and it doesn't matter if the physics body are lagging behind. That's normal in the debug. But you can see that we are already driving around with some issues here and there. So let's have a look at the wheel blueprints and see if we have to make any adjustment. So as we just know that our bike is skidding a lot, so let's go into the blueprints for it, and especially the rear wheel. Let's open that. And under properties, so first of all, wheel radius, it's 40. We have seen that from the sphere it's more like 47, so we can, for example, put in a 45, just to make it a bit more similar to what it is in reality, and that will help with the rotation speed. The other one is friction multiplier. It's a 4. Let's put, for example, at 8. Let's double it and see we get a bit more grip. But we still have to add the torque control and the torque rotation control. So let's prepare for that. Let's save and close. Actually, make sure that affected by brake is fine, by end brake, yeah, and also by the engine. So that's all good. And now let's do the same with the front one. I think that also has to have a wheel radius 45. Wheel radius 45. Below, it's only affected by the brake. That's fine. No engine, no handbrake. That's all good. And compile and save. Let's do another test drive. We didn't adjust in this case the multiplier. Maybe seemed to be steering well, but let's see. Maybe we want to take this to 4. Okay. Let's see if it rides a bit better. By the way, we still have our debug on. Still some grip issues, seems to be turning very quickly. Well, let's see what happens once we have added the torque control. So to add torque control, content drawer, and let's go to the blueprint of the bike, and under vehicle movement component, if you scroll down, at a certain point you will find a section which is called arcade control. Okay, so now bear with me because we have to put in a lot of numbers. Well, not a lot, but a few. So first of all, we enable torque control, and for rotation damping, which is by default 0.02, we enter a 15. That will be a lot of rotational damping useful for stability. Then in the target rotation control section, we enable that one, and we also enable roll versus speed enabled. So what this does will adjust the roll depending on the speed. And of course the inclination, left or right inclination of the bike is related to roll, so we'll mostly be working on that. So roll control scaling, you want to enter a 1. Roll max angle, 35 degrees. Then scroll down. Rotation stiffness will enter 100. Rotation damping will enter a 10, which is 1/10 of what we enter for the rotation stiffness. That's a bit of rule of thumb. Max acceleration will enter 100. And then auto center roll strength, we'll put it to 1. And that's basically what we need to make this arcade control work properly for the bike. Of course, if you're using it for a different vehicle, maybe an airplane or a boat, you will have to use different numbers. But for this bike with this mass and this setup, that should be it. So let's compile and save and see how it drives. And actually, we want to turn off the debugging for the moment. So if you use arrow up, you will see your previous debugging command. I'm turning off chaos debug through enabled, so we don't see anymore the debugging. Wait, let's see if it drives a bit better. And if we have torque control, yes, that looks good. I think that's getting closer to what we need for a bike. And of course, let's see at high speed, maybe we'll still be skidding probably. Yes, a bit. Oh, okay. Yeah, but that's normal, of course. I mean, we can increase the lateral grip if we want to, but that might not be necessary, depending on the type of game that you're creating. And actually it drives pretty well, even though I'm using my keys and not any joystick or any gamepad. It's driving fairly well. Let's see how it behaves on a jump. We managed to get there. Wow, looks good to me. Looks good to me. Okay, last we need to fix the animation. Oh, by the way, note that the front tire is a bit above the ground, so actually we need a slightly smaller wheel radius apparently. So let's fix that. So back to content drawer, front wheel, with the 45, maybe we need a 42. Let's see what that's the case. Yeah, better, much better. Looks good, looks good. Nice. Okay, so last but not least, we need to fix the animations, of course, because right now wheels are not animating, the fork is not animating. So we want to fix that. Okay, so let's go to the vehicles folder, and then under sports car, we identify the animation blueprint of the sports car, and we're gonna borrow this one, so we don't have to redo it from scratch, but we could also easily redo it from scratch. So I'm gonna take it and drag it on top of the chopper folder, and then say copy here. Okay, now this is still parented to the car. So what we want to do is right click, assign skeleton, and we'll use the select the chopper skeleton and accept. So once this is done, you will see that also the thumbnail changes into the one for our bike, meaning that, okay, we are now parented to the bike. And let's open the anim graph. So first of all, we have a control rig in here that we don't need, so we're gonna delete the control rig, okay? And this component to local, I think it can stay here. Now what we have is the wheel controller. This comes from the vehicle movement component. It's the one that is making the wheel turn and also steer, but we don't see them because this is applied actually to the physics wheel. So what we want to do is, well, a few things. So first of all, let's fix the steering part, okay? And for that, we'll be using a look at node. So right click, look at. Perfect, and let's connect it. And let's connect it also to component to local. And now let's configure this node. So bone to modify, this is basically the node for our fork, the front fork, because we want to orient it depending on the steering angle that is applied to the invisible front physics wheel, okay? So we will use look at axis of 0010, that's perfect. and we want to uncheck in local space, but we want to use a lookup axis. And this lookup axis is going to be 0, 0, 1. So basically it's a Z-oriented axis, and make sure that it's in local space. And then down here we say, okay, what's your look at target? And our look at target is the front physics wheel. That's the one that we want to use a target for. And for look at, it's going to be 0, 100, because we want to look laterally, so along the lateral axis, which is the axis of rotation. And that's pretty much it. So let's compile and save and see whether we already get our steering. And we don't see it. So let's go back to the animation blueprint, and actually the problem is we didn't assign it. So blueprints, chopper, open the blueprint, go to the mesh, and you see that we are still using the animation blueprint of the car, but now this is assigned to different skeletons, so it would never work. And now let's find the animation blueprint actually for the chopper. We have two because we haven't renamed it, so that's not very handy. So let's go in here and rename this one as chopper and MVP. So now we can tell it apart from the other. So back into the blueprint, skeletal mesh, and let's now select our chopper animation blueprint, and here it is. Compile and save, and now let's see if whether the steering works. And yes, it does. Perfect. So now we have the steering actually working also nicely, I would say. And remember, we didn't adjust yet the steering for speed, so we have still to adjust a bit the steering curve, but that looks already good. So next we want to make the wheels rotate, because at the moment they are not. So back into the content drawer and into our vehicles chopper folder, let's open again the animation blueprint, and let's give ourselves a bit of room. So basically what we are doing for the rear wheel, that's easy. We are going to use a copy bone node. By the way, everything I'm doing here can also be done with the control rig, but you know, this is slightly easier, at least for a tutorial of this kind. And then we're going to do a copy rotation, and the rotation that we want to copy is from, well, source bone, that will be the rear physics wheel, and target bone, that will be the rear wheel. So very easy. Compile and save, and let's test it already, because it's always nice to see that our modifications are working. And yes, now you see the rear wheel properly rotating, so that's pretty cool. And now let's do the same for the front wheel. So again, open the animation blueprint, give ourselves a bit of room. Actually, we can Control D, duplicate this node, and just stick it in. And let's do rear physics wheel. Actually, now we have to change it to front physics wheel, and it will rotate the front wheel. Now let's see how that works. And apparently it works well. So we have, actually I would have the tendency to, no, I think it's fine. I wanted to adjust slightly more the radius for the front wheel, but looks good from here. You might have a different taste. Okay. Depends on how you like it also. When bike is inclining. You might want a different look and feel. But that's up to you, of course. Yeah, right now it looks like it's going a bit into the terrain. Anyways, I think that's a conclusion of our tutorial, and that's exactly what we have built easily using the arcade controls of Chaos Vehicles, which of course are undocumented, but by looking into the source code and with a bit of trials and errors, I think you can really work with them, and our bike is also nicely doing evolutions through this posts. So I think that's it. Let's conclude with a nice jump maybe. And thanks for watching, and see you in the next tutorial.